Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another easy PvE build guide. Today's build is Condition Scourge. Condition Scourge is a very straightforward and strong condition damage build for instance content, especially with a simplified rotation like the one I use. It's also a great pick for solo gameplay as it can provide itself with good amounts of many essential boons. In this case Alacrity, Protection, Fury and Might, and substantial amounts of barrier. It is therefore inherently resilient and also provides good Defiance bar damage. Finally, it can also be adjusted to provide Alacrity to allies easily without any adjustments to gear whatsoever. Let's begin with a general playstyle and rotation concept for instance content. The most important mechanic on Scourge is the Manifest Sand Shade skill. Using this, we'll place a shade at the targeted location which stays there for 8 seconds. The Shroud skills on Scourge all affect the area around your character and each shade you have placed, allowing for interesting tactical gameplay. You can plan ahead by placing shades shortly before enemies spawn, for example, focus on something else and still have your Shroud skills hit them. The shades have an 8-second cooldown, allowing you to maintain one shade permanently. This will become easier if you have Alacrity up. Keeping one shade up is also very important to keep the buffs from Sand Sage up, increasing your condition duration and boon duration by 15%. On a side note, 15 expertise or concentration convert into 1% condition duration and boon duration respectively. On Scourge, most of your damage comes from applying Torment, Bleeding and Burning, and this brings me to the rotation concept. Scourge is a fully ranged build by default aside from the skill Plague Lance, making it very convenient for all kinds of gameplay as you can freely position yourself and still maintain a high damage output. The rotation I propose here is very simple, as it involves using your weapon and utility skills on cooldown. With pistol on the main hand, you do not even have to keep track of an auto attack chain. If you lack access to pistol, using a scepter instead is a little worse, but just fine. The fully optimized rotation involves using both anyway. Aside from your weapon and utility skills, use Manifest Sand Shade and Nefarious Favor on cooldown. We're using Nefarious Favor to trigger the trait Sadistic Searing as often as possible. In order to understand the rotation design, it's important to know that Blood is Power applies Bleeding and Torment to yourself. For maximum damage output, you want to transfer these conditions to enemies as soon as they are applied to you. To do that, always pair Desert Shroud and Blood is Power. Desert Shroud applies the buff from the trait Plague Sanding for 6 seconds, and the hit from Blood is Power immediately transfers the self-bleeding and Torment. What you need to be aware of is though, that using both counts of Blood is Power as soon as possible is not ideal for sustained damage, as it has a longer cooldown than Desert Shroud. If you use both Blood is Power counts too soon, you will end up having to delay Desert Shroud to be able to transfer the self-bleeding and Torment. In actual group, they usually get cleansed off before you can transfer them in that case. Aside from Blood is Power, Plague Lance will also apply conditions to yourself. Since it's just one stack of poison and one stack of bleeding, it is fine to have them cleansed and not transfer them. Sometimes when Blood is Power and Plague Lance coincide, prioritize combining Blood is Power and Desert Shroud. Akin to all necromancers, Scourge gains life force from nearby deaths or by using skills that directly grant it. The rotation will slowly drain your life force pool against a single enemy. As soon as something around you dies occasionally, you should not have any life force issues in the long run. If you do need additional life force, replace Signet of Spite with Summon Shadow Fiend. When it comes to breakbar damage, you do have a few skills built into the kit. Pistol 3 Vile Blast and Torch 5 Oppressive Collapse are part of your general rotation. You can save them for breakbar damage if you need to. On top of those, you can use Garish Pillar Shroud 4 if you have the life force to do that. Finally, since we're not using a second offhand weapon, you can put on a Warhorn there to use Wail of Doom, Warhorn 4. Let's move on to gear and traits. In terms of gear, it's important that you reach 65% condition duration in the hero panel. The traits Sand Sage and Barbed Precision together with Torment Duration Food give the remaining 35% for bleeding and 30% for Torment. On top of that, we're maximizing on condition damage and critical chance to trigger the trait Barbed Precision reliably. In order to do that, we're using full Viper's gear with the superior rune of the Trapper on the armor and superior sigils of Torment and Bursting on the weapons. If you want a budget variant that you can get immediately, simply replace all ascended armor pieces and trinkets of Vipers with rare exotic ritualists. In terms of traits, we're using Curses, Soul Reaping and Scourge. Curses is the bread and butter trait line for condition necromancers as it includes traits that increase bleeding output, duration and general condition damage. The trait Barbed Precision applies bleeding with a 33% chance on critical hits, which is why we want to have a decent amount of critical chance on Condi Necros. In Soul Reaping, the most relevant traits are Soul Barbs and Doomfire. Soul Barbs increases damage by 10% for 15 seconds after entering or exiting Shroud. On Scourge, that's pretty easy to reach by casting Desert Shroud on cooldown. Doomfire empowers your shades to apply additional burning. Scourge will empower your Torment and Burning via the traits Demonic Law and Fell Beacon respectively. Due to the traits Sand Sage and Blood is Sand, you should always maintain one shade as I mentioned before. This will reduce your incoming damage and increase both boon duration and condition duration. Great, now you should have an understanding of a simple to execute Scourge build for instance content. Let's look at how we can adjust that for open world, because there it can make sense to make a build more forgiving so that you can sustain on your own. So let's look at ways to increase general survivability, cover essential boons, and deal with conditions and incoming control effects. The first step to increase survivability is to change a few traits around. We're going to swap out Soul Reaping for Death Magic and use Abrasive Grit, Desert Empowerment and Herald of Sorrow in Scourge. On top of those, we're going to switch to Parasitic Contagion in Curses. So essentially, you could describe it as playing Alacrity Scourge with Death Magic. That way, you obtain massive amounts of toughness, permanent coverage of protection and passive healing at a fairly small damage loss. In Death Magic, the traits Putrid Defense and Corruptor's Fervor will stack up Death Scarapace very fast and thus provide pulsing protection when you have more than 25 stacks. Each stack of poison you apply grants 2 stacks of Death Scarapace. Starting combat with Manifest Sandshade, Weeping Shots and Vile Blast would stack up 30 stacks within 2 seconds of starting combat. The trait Herald of Sorrow adjusts your Shroud to provide protection and pulsing barrier via Sandstorm Shroud, which is great to bolster yourself when starting combat prior to stacking Death Scarapace up. Finally, Deadly Strength will also give large amounts of power and condition damage per stack of Death Scarapace. Parasitic Contagion in Curses heals you for 5% of your outgoing condition damage, which is a nice passive heal you get as long as you keep applying conditions. On top of all of this, we have a massive inflow of Barrier, which we will increase further by using Sand Flare and Serpent Siphon as utility skills. With this kit of traits and utility skills, pretty much anything you do will apply a barrier to you. And each time you apply barrier to yourself or allies, you will also apply Alacrity, Might and Cleanse conditions off of them. If all of that isn't enough, you can use Survivability Food and a utility item for another minus 10% damage taken and 150 toughness. Let's look at boon coverage now. The coverage of protection I already explained. So we're going to focus on Might, Fury, Alacrity and Quickness. For Might coverage we have Abrasive Grit, Desiccate and Oppressive Collapse. All of these will apply Might in an area, which is nice to have. The trait Furious Demise in Curses and Desiccate will apply Fury to you. Fury gives you a lot of critical chance, which in turn is important to trigger Barbed Precision more often. The coverage of Alacrity in this build is very simple, as you will apply it every time you apply a barrier to yourself or allies. The only boon that Scourge is missing by default is Quickness. If you can, for Quickness, make use of Jade Protocols. These will give 150 additional toughness, vitality, condition damage and power, as well as all boons aside from stability, resistance and resolution on entering combat. These effects can be pre-stacked by using an enchanted Snow Diamond tonic repeatedly when out of combat. Now, in story instances, or if you don't want the hassle of reapplying protocols, you can abuse the synergy between Relic of the Cavalier and the skill Blast from the Sky Scale to apply lots of Aegis, Resistance, Might and Quickness to yourself. It has an internal cooldown of 1 second and thus applies the boons on every hit of Blast. On top of those essential boons, Serpent Siphon will apply area Aegis once and additional regeneration, allowing you to maintain a good uptime on that. Finally, let's talk about how to deal with conditions and incoming control effects. This build is packed with condition cleanses, you don't even need to think about them. With the trait Abrasive Grit, each time you apply barrier to anyone, you will also cleanse condition off of them, which is basically always. On top of that, you have Nefarious Favor available, which cleanses conditions in an area with a very short cooldown and without a cast time. In terms of stun breaks, I see 3 options as viable. The first one is Spectral Walk. This cleanses conditions, allows you to cover swiftness on yourself and is a stun break. The second one is Spectral Armor. This will grant you a lot of life force under pressure, provides additional protection and is a stun break. The protection on this is kinda overkill in this build since you're covering it anyway. Last but not least, Trade of Anguish grants stability, swiftness, is a stun break and applies burning. It has the shortest cooldown of the available stun breaks, so keep that in mind. Overall, Condition Scourge, even with Viper gear, is one of the strongest open world builds you can play. It's very simple to execute well, has insane survivability, and can deal with basically anything that open world can throw at you. Most of the time, you will not even see enemies touching your actual health bar. That's it for today. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. I hope this video was insightful for you and made you want to try Condition Scourge. See you next time and happy shade spamming.